Hi, everybody. This is Bill. Welcome you back to another installment of Billboard Comics, another installment of our sub-feature, Growing Up Comics. This it will be dedicated to a specific time. I was pretty much all grown up by this time. It happened around, I think, 2000, where being a comic book collector went from being kind of like an ostracizing feature of my personality to more accepted. It was a profound change in my life, and I noticed it. I don't know if you noticed it too. If you did, let me know in the comments. Also, like and subscribe. Always helps the algorithm, and I really would appreciate it. However, what I'm going to be talking about today is the X-Men, the first X-Men movie from Fox that made it cooler to be a comic book fan. For those who don't know, the X-Men in comic books were a big deal at this time. They went from being a comic book that was almost canceled, that was published only like bi-monthly, and they were publishing only like reprints of earlier issues, to becoming like the biggest, most talked about comic book concept in the world. Through Dave Cockrum and Chris Claremont and John Byrne and Len Wein, they rebuilt a concept that was headed for the trash heap and turned out to be Marvel's best-selling book. A book that's certainly, almost at the height of its popularity and fame, almost impervious to anything that could possibly even affect it. John Byrne leaves the book. Dave Cockrum comes back. No big deal. Dave Cockrum leaves. He's replaced by Paul Smith. Keeps on going. Paul Smith is replaced by John Romita Jr. Keeps on going. It made the names of Jim Lee and Mark Silvestri, allowing them to go out on their own and start their own company in Image Comics. It was a big deal. But towards the end of the 90s, there's always basically a kind of a plan to adapt comic books into films. Superman and Batman made it to the big screen, but other concepts like Watchmen was in development hell in the late 80s and early 90s. So was Spider-Man. So was the X-Men. The X-Men had a lot of times stop and go. I believe Jerry Conway and Roy Thomas even made a prospectus to this in the 80s to try to get the stuff around. But it wasn't until like Blade in the late 90s that the comic book movie really seemed to pick up speed. A lot of people don't give it the credit it deserves, but Blade was a C-list character who really didn't have a long run in the comic books, wasn't as famous as Superman, wasn't as popular as Spider-Man, but they made a movie, bring with him, that made a boatload of money and spawned 2 sequels. And it showed to studios that comic books can be a big moneymaker. This brought interest into all other properties that are already around there. Fantastic Four, of course, had the abortive 1994 Roger Corman one just to keep the rights, so they could eventually make the Tim Story versions about a decade later, give or take. The Spider-Man thing went from a Toby Hooper concept where man was turned into a living spider, a giant spider, into a Jim Cameron version, which was closer to the comic books, which never got made, which really became the Sam Raimi movies that we became known for in like 2002. But with the concept as popular as the X-Men, it became part of the stuff that left development hell and became an actual comic book movie. Now, when it came out in like 2000, I kind of had an idea. I was kind of a little worried about it. I was worried about the one part in particular, and it turns out that it was the part that actually kind of helped make me more popular amongst my friends and my co-workers at the time. It was the casting of Wolverine. Now, we all know Hugh Jackman is Wolverine. Legendary. He's been doing it for a quarter of a century, And even though he says he should give it up because he's too old, he still does it better than anybody else. He's the best at it as what he does. And what he does is play Wolverine, and he's fantastic. But at the time, he was a replacement, kind of a last-minute replacement. The story goes like the original cast, and this is pretty much official, was Dougray Scott. Dougray, I believe his name is actually name. He's a Scottish man. He eventually became a character on the Batwoman TV series decades later, but he was originally cast as Wolverine, and he fits the look. He looks kind of like a burly, kind of like irascible kind of character. However, he was cast there at the same time he was doing the Mission Impossible 2. I believe it was Mission Impossible 2, and he was cast in that, and the shooting went over on that, and he was required for reshoots and all kinds of stuff like that. So he had to back away from the role of Wolverine. Producers tried to go to another young and up-and-coming actor at the time. Hard to believe it, but yes, Russell Crowe. He was at the point in his career, before I think he won all the Oscars and made all legendary movies, was a kind of a get for a comic book movie. He refused. He didn't want to do it, but he recommended to a fellow Australian actor that he knew called Hugh Jackman. Hugh Jackman was a complete unknown in the United States at the time, which isn't surprising because there's a lot of the comic book film industry is littered with people who were kind of unknowns before they became a comic book hero in a comic book movie. Sorry, a comic book movie. But what disturbed comic book fans is that the Hugh Jackman was most known for being in musical theater in his native Australia and even I think in the United States. I think he had a tour of Oklahoma in the United States. When you think of Wolverine, you think of somebody who does not break out into show tunes. He's not going to be the guy who's going to be like doing a little song and dance number as he's stabbing people with his sharpened claws that come out of stuff. The comic book community at the time, as I recall too, and this is based on my feelings, it might not be yours, might not be anybody's, but this is what I was thinking about. We're still kind of hesitant about we saw a lot more comic book movies coming into fruition and being made, but the specter of the Batman 66 series was still over our heads. Yes, Batman 1989 was a great step in the right direction. The Dark Knight finally coming to the screen in the way it deserved. But towards the end of that, it became a campy mess with bad credit cards and close-up of all the characters' butts as they're putting on their costumes. Superman did the same thing at the time. Like, it started off as being relatively good, but behind the scenes, that just due to Richard Donner's struggle with the studio, that declined into camp and parody. So we're all kind of self-shocked about having like something we hold dear fall into something that would be silly and not at all kind of like conducive to what we expect of the comic book an adaptation to be. And worst of all, if it comes out as being a big blockbuster and it becomes a hit, and it's a silly piece of garbage, then once again, all the comic book collectors around would be considered to be, mentally deficient nabobs who are clinging on to their childhood way too tight and really should grow up and therefore be worthy of mockery and being the butt of many jokes. That might be me. I had a different experience than you. I might be more bitter than you, but nonetheless, that's my attitude coming towards that. So when a Song and Dance Man from Australia was picked to be the Canadian Wolverine, I was hesitant, and a lot of people online were also hesitant too. And then I remember one time I saw like a still from it, and it's a still from the train thing where Magneto collects Rogue from him, and he's back there, stuff like this, and like he looked like he had a triple chin because he's basically being forced back. And I was like, oh wow, this not only is this guy like a Song and Dance Man, he's not really, he's kind of a stocky thing like this. So I don't remember when I finally felt comfortable with Hugh Jackman in the role of Wolverine. It might have been the trailers, but it was definitely by the time he first appears on the screen. He has one of the first best introductions of any comic book character on any comic book movie ever. To remind you, or if you haven't seen it, here's a spoiler for you. You should probably have seen it already. It's on Disney Plus. Give it a chance. Give it a look. It's a CD bar. Ro comes in. She's a teenage runaway who's trying to get away because her powers almost killed somebody, and she's looking for, just a way to, escape, get away from someplace. She comes to this bar, and the bar has live entertainment. Live entertainment is a pit. It's pit fighting. You're going in against this guy, and you try your last 3 minutes, and if you do, you win money. If not, thank you for your donation. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. The guy is against this is how I remember it. It could be different. This might be Mandela effect, but like this. Guy is leaning against the thing, drinking whiskey, hand up against the cage, shirt off. He doesn't look that tough, but he has the kind of like a weird haircut. Comes in, big burly guy, about a foot taller than the guy against the cage. Comes in. You think he's going to wipe the floor with him. The guy in the cage, Hugh Jackman, Wolverine, comes in and makes short work of him, makes easy work of him. I think there's a headbutt or two in there, which if you get hit by a guy with a metal skull, yeah, it's going to hurt. The guy lasted maybe 2 minutes, if that, before he's taken out, and the call goes out for more other kind of contenders. This was our first introduction to Wolverine. And right then and there, if I had any like kind of like compunction about him not being great, it was gone by then. They portrayed him as being the ultimate badass, as Wolverine should be. That's not the origin of Wolverine from the comic books. That's not how we first met Wolverine in comic books. He was a government flunky who was trying to get the Hulk out of Canada because somehow Hulk wandered up with Wendigo up to Canada, and that's how he made his first appearance. But it kind of encapsulates the 25 years of characterization of the character up to that point in one simple scene that was amazing. Like, it's just like I and this is gonna sound weird I don't do this just with comic book movies. If a movie is good and has like really sings and does a really good point, a really good dialogue, a really good plot point, and things mesh together and it works really well, I get like start vibrating in happiness about this, and I got that there. This was the Wolverine we needed. This is the Wolverine we wanted. This is the Wolverine that the movie needed. Obviously, Hugh Jackman and Wolverine became a breakout star of this, and that's pretty hard to do because they had established actors like Halle Berry and Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart in the whole production. And it wasn't a perfect like note for note X-Men. The team was made up of basically a skeleton crew. I believe there's only Cyclops, Storm, and eventually Wolverine. And Professor X. There's no Nightcrawler at this time. There's no Bishop. There's no Gambit. There's none of the Psylocke. There's none of the other ones. Jean Grey was also there. But like, Jean Grey was in the movie, but it was kind of like a skeleton crew. It was kind of like, we're not going to go all in and making this a big, expensive kind of like with all the characters in there. We're going to go small and see how it works and build from there, and if get future movies, which they did to various effects, which I might cover if I ever do my history of the comic book film segment again here. But I digress. It became a hit. And it became a hit not just with like the comic book collecting crowd, which loved it, which, who cares if they're not wearing the yellow spandex, or, Cyclops doesn't have a big yellow visor around his eyes. It's instead of black. If it has black leather, it's like, who cares? It is true to the tone. It was true to the feeling behind it, and the message behind it about the persecution of the mutants as being an allegory for persecution of other real life people who are experiencing persecution, whether it be the blacks, the gays, the Jews, whoever. All that was captured by this stuff like this. But it's not popular just with like the comic book people. It's also popular with people who never read a comic book in their life. People who might have run into the things thought looked like weird and trippy, and decided to actually give it a shot and see how it happens, see what it would look like. And these are the people who I worked with at the time. I was working at a center for marketing student loans, which, just by saying that, you probably know what it is, and you probably consider me to be something close to Satan. I understand, I get that. I've done a couple jobs that were really unpopular jobs with most of the people. However, people would come up to my desk after it. Hey, Bill, I just saw the X-Men. That Wolverine, is that how it's in the comic books? Ooh, it's different. Ooh, and like we got a discussion. People who were kind of like maybe dismissive of like comic books in general, all of a sudden came to me as the expert on the comic books. Tell me about this X-Men movie. Does the Toad really work like that? Does he look like that in the comic books? What happened is like what other characters like this? Like was this the original X-Men? Like they were so excited about the movie. They wanted to find out more about the movie, and they found out they wanted to ask me about the movie because they knew it was in the comic books. From people who granted 90% of people were people who I was friends with and who didn't like look down their noses at me about that. But there were one or two people who were kind of like who were coming up to my desk the Monday after the film debuted, asking me to tell them everything about the X-Men movies and where it might go from here and stuff like this. It became a cachet. I don't know if it involved with anybody else. This is just my personal. This is the growing up comics is my personal recollections of growing up. This is where I felt comfortable from this point on, telling people that I was a comic book collector. I felt comfortable saying like, yeah, I'm into comic books, because the X-Men movie, and not just that, but the X-Men movies leading into the Spider-Man movies, and then the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and the new Superman movies and DCEU, and all like every year eventually having like 4 or 5 comic book movies. It became a big thing. It became cool to be a comic book collector. It became acceptable and or at the very least understandable by people. The great part about the X-Men movie, it showed why comic books were so exciting to collectors like me and other people. I just like a switch went off. It was like I went from being kind of like like looked on as being like the weirdo who liked comic books, to being the person who could answer the questions about that. Ooh, I heard there's a Deadpool movie on. What can you tell me about that guy? Oh, hey, Spider-Man, is it going to be any good? Do you think it's going to be any good? The trailer looks pretty good. Being a movie buff, like, yeah, Sam Raimi's doing it. He did the Evil Dead stuff. He also did like Oscar-worthy stuff. It's going to be good. Give it a shot. It should be, give it a shot. And like, oh my God, that was great. Is that what happened? Like, and like, big thing was like comparing the comic books storyline to the movie storyline, and telling what was different, and tell them like let them figure out which was better and which wasn't worse. I don't know if I created any comic book collectors at that time, but at least I got expanded their horizons, at least in my egotistical way, expanded their horizons so they could actually like view it as being a valid art form instead of just being something that weirdos did. So yeah, so that's my experience with X-Men, the movie that made being a comic book collector cool. Did you have any similar experience with that? Did you find people treat you different as being a comic book collector after that movie, or any movie? Maybe it was the Spider-Man movies. Maybe it was earlier than that, Blade. Maybe it was it never hit you, and people still consider you to be an oddball. If you did, we like you here, and you have a home here, and you don't have to worry about being an oddball because we're all odd here. We're all odd. Not hot. Some of us are hot and odd. Not me, but I'm just odd and weird, as you could tell by me going on about this. But nonetheless, what was your experience with this? Did you see a change in this? Did you see a kind of like the way people viewed you? Did you find yourself had a new cachet amongst your friends and strangers in your community? Let me know in the comments. If you made it this far and you liked what you saw, hit me up with a like button. Hit the like button. It costs nothing and helps with the algorithm, and I really, really would appreciate it. And I'm going to be doing more of these along. I have a whole bunch of list of stuff about reminiscences about me growing up, all the way from when I was a little kid to me being an adult, that I'm going to look back on, and you might have a similar trip down memory lane to go with me. Take a look, subscribe, and I'll be publishing more of these. But thank you for coming out, and I hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, keep on collecting.